Moses. This has been a long time coming.
Revenge of the Remakes.
The Ten Commandments and The Prince of Egypt. Now, where do I start with these two movies? Well, I guess I'll start where I always start whenever I talk about biblical media, and it's the sad fact that a lot of the time, they're just not good. But fortunately, this is a positive video because both of these adaptations are really good. Both of these movies attempt to adapt the Exodus story found in the Bible. You know, the story of Moses leading God's people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and into the freedom of the desert across the Red Sea. And both of these movies do a very good job, although they both take very different approaches in getting there, and that's really what I want to break down for the sake of this comparison, because both are successful movies. Neither one is bad. In fact, I watched both of them again. I've watched both of them multiple times throughout my life, so I'm very familiar with the differences and similarities between these stories. And so we're just going to have a little bit of fun today talking about two epic movies that really understand and respect the source material that it's derived from. But the first thing I want to talk about is the different approach taken by each filmmaker and how they brought this story to the big screen. Now, in the case of Cecil B. DeMille's original 1956 Ten Commandments, which is actually a remake from the 20s version, which was silent and used actually a lot of the similar techniques as far as visual effects go. But we're not talking about that, we're just talking about the 1956 version because I feel like that is more or less the definitive version, and generally I just think it's better. This movie out of the gate really wants you to know that it is taking the source material seriously and really wants to express it with all the due respect and reverence that this story deserves. And because of that, it takes itself very seriously, and it is 3 hours and 40 minutes long, which is only like, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes shorter than Gone with the Wind, so yeah, you're in it for the long haul here. But what's so refreshing is that reverence that DeMille brings to this story, because in the very beginning you see Cecil B. DeMille, the director, producer, head honcho of this movie, come out from behind a curtain as if this is the beginning of Frankenstein or something. And he talks about how important the story is and how they've consulted the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus and all these ancient scholars in order to deliver the most historically accurate depiction that they could do back in 1956. And that attitude permeates this whole movie. You watch this movie and you're like, yeah, this is a very important movie. It's arguably the single most important story in the Torah for the Jewish people, and it's where they really come into their own identity as a nation, as a people group. It's from Exodus. And because of that, this is a big movie. Big in every sense of the word. It's long, yeah, but it's also just epic in scale. The sets, even the special effects, which I'll get to, and not all of them hold up as well as I really want them to, but even those were incredibly ambitious for the time period. But on the other hand, we have Prince of Egypt, and Prince of Egypt, I was actually kind of impressed at how reverent and respectful it was to the source material. In fact, this movie opens in, well, maybe not as theatrical a fashion as the Ten Commandments does, but it does open with some texts iterating how important this story is and how it's the backbone of faith for millions of people worldwide, and how they've endeavored to try to keep the spirit of the story alive, even though artistic license, of course, has been used. And watching the movie that follows, you do believe that they really put their best foot forward in creating something important. Now, it doesn't feel as grand or epic or big as the Ten Commandments. It's actually a way more intimate story, although the animation doesn't lose that epic feel. You see Egypt and it looks great. In fact, there are some shots of the pyramids, of the structures and the palaces that actually do rival those in Ten Commandments. That's not really where the focus of the story is. The focus is actually a much more personal story about Moses and Ramses. But that's not all, because it's also a musical, and the songs actually make it better, which is really weird for me to say out loud, because you think an animated musical adaptation from Dreamworks, the people that made Shrek, this sounds dead on arrival. But you really do believe that the people in charge of this movie, Spielberg, Katzenberg, and that third guy, they really put their best foot forward in making something that resonates with both kids and adults in a similar way that the Ten Commandments did way back in the 50s. But now let's get into the actual plotting of this movie, because the original Ten Commandments has a lot of plot in it. It's the story of Moses. You see pretty much his whole life. It does get abridged quite a bit towards the very end, starting with him as a baby getting picked up by Pharaoh's daughter so he doesn't get killed like all the other babies of his day. And then you see him as a young adult played by Charlton Heston in the role that probably made his career. And in Prince of Egypt, he's played very well by Val Kilmer, and I really want to compare these two Moseses because they're very different. Charlton Heston brings kind of what you would expect from a Charlton Heston Moses. He's strong, he's masculine, he's a leader, he takes charge, he's smart, he knows how to talk to people, he knows how to lead people, he builds this city for Pharaoh, and because of that you can see how his natural take charge leadership instincts will serve him well when he has to lead an entire nation of people to freedom. But Val Kilmer plays it very different. He plays it more as the everyman. He's kind of unsure of himself. He doesn't really know what he wants to do with his life. He's kind of carefree. And on top of that, he's a bit of a prankster and kind of gets himself and Ramses into trouble from time to time. But that does change pretty significantly when he does meet God at the burning bush and he gets his calling and he finds purpose, and then he returns and he's much more of that let my people go stoic, intense Moses that we know from the Bible. But I would argue that neither one of these actors really bring the pre-burning bush Moses that I always pictured. It always seemed, at least to me, that Moses, as he was growing up in Egypt, was kind of meek. Yes, he was a soldier, he was a prince of Egypt, so I'm sure he had some battle training and he was capable, and I'm sure he was strong physically. But the Bible says that he wasn't a strong speaker. People speculate that he might have had a stuttering problem or a speech impediment. That's something that really hasn't been brought to light in any Moses movie that I've seen, and it's something I'd actually really like to see, and it kind of disappoints me looking back on these movies that that's never really addressed. But as far as general personality, I do think that the Prince of Egypt Moses leans a little bit closer to probably how he was feeling emotionally before he got his purpose and his call. Whereas Charlton Heston's performance, you just feel like he was destined for greatness and he was just already kind of prepared for what God was calling him to do. So you don't see as much of a difference or an arc before he meets God versus after. But now let's talk about Ramses, because this is also very different from version to version. In the Ten Commandments, he's played by Yul Brynner, and in the remake, he's played by Ralph Fiennes. And I don't know about you, but whenever I see Yul Brynner in anything, he immediately grabs my attention. He just has this menacing, intense stare and intense presence where no matter what role he's playing, you could be a good guy, you could be a bad guy, but you're always watching him, you're always waiting for him to do something, because he just has that, and he brings that to Ramses. Ramses is a bad dude in the Ten Commandments. You can tell right away that this dude is trouble. He's trying to undercut Moses. He's trying to weasel his way up into his father's good graces so that he'll be bestowed the title of Pharaoh, as well as get Nefertiti as his queen, both of which seem to be going more towards Moses' favor, since Moses is, Charlton Heston, the Superman. So because of that, it does paint Ramses more of your typical villain in a movie like this, where you do see his motivation, you do understand where he's coming from, but you can just tell that he does not value human life, he doesn't have sympathy or compassion, he's very narcissistic, and so he's just not going to be a good pharaoh, even from the very beginning. Ralph Fiennes' Ramses, on the other hand, is a lot more sympathetic. You see him and Moses bonding a lot more. In the Ten Commandments, you don't really see any kind of relationship between Moses and Ramses. They're brothers, yeah, but they don't really look at each other like brothers. There's no love or affection. In Prince of Egypt, you get that love and affection. You understand that they've had fun together, they grew up together, they're best friends, they're brothers, they really do care about each other. And when Moses has to come back and tell him to let his people go, it really does divide their relationship, and that relationship is handled so well, and Ralph Fiennes' performance is so good in it, where it really is the thing that elevates this movie into competition with the Ten Commandments as the best Moses movie ever. But that's not to say the Ten Commandments doesn't focus on any interpersonal relationships. It does, it just chooses to focus a lot more on the romantic elements. Moses' relationship when he was in Egypt with Nefertiti, who is the pharaoh princess who's destined to marry whoever becomes the next pharaoh. And Nefertiti is desperately in love with Moses. She loves him, she respects him, she thinks he's going to be the best pharaoh ever, she wants to marry him. But of course you got Ramses over there who's scheming, he really wants that throne, and he actually doesn't really care that much about Nefertiti, he just wants her as a prize. But you really get a sense that Nefertiti and Moses have a relationship, and you're kind of rooting for them in the beginning of the movie, even though you know it's not going to end well, you know where this is going, he's not going to marry her. But they actually do such a good job where you kind of want to forget that you know that this is destined to fail, and you just kind of want to revel in the pleasures of today. But if you know the story, that all changes when Moses kills the Egyptian. And what's interesting is that I like the killing of the Egyptian better in the Ten Commandments, but I like the expulsion of Moses better in Prince of Egypt. So it's kind of a weird combination of preferences. Because in the Ten Commandments, the Egyptian that Moses kills is this overseer, Baca, and he's played by Vincent Price. And Vincent Price is reveling in this performance. It's pretty similar to every other Vincent Price performance that you've seen, where he just enjoys being evil. He enjoys hurting people. And he's punishing Joshua for insubordination. He's about to kill him, and Moses busts in and kills Baca and saves Joshua's life. Oh yeah, and Joshua's a character in this movie. And Joshua, played by John Derek, is a very welcomed addition to this cast. Because really, Joshua would have been around in Egypt. He was Moses' successor. He was a bit younger than Moses. So he would have been kicking around this time. Every time I see this movie, somehow I forget that he's in here. So when he shows up, I'm like, oh yeah, Joshua, the Jericho guy. And it just makes me really want to see a sequel of Ten Commandments about Joshua, and to see his conquests in the Promised Land and see Jericho fall and all those great stories that we have of Joshua. Because even though Joshua's very young in this movie, he's inexperienced, he's just a woodcutter, you do see those leadership qualities in him as well. And that's something that this movie does very well. It establishes character and personality in a very short amount of time because of the casting. The casting is so good here, like Vincent Price, for example. You get him immediately. You get everything that he's about. He's slimy, he's sadistic, he revels in the misery of others, and you just want to see him die. And when he dies, it's so satisfying because it's Vincent Price. Whereas Prince of Egypt has good casting too, but the focus in that movie is kept so much on Moses and Ramses, which is why when Moses kills the Egyptian in that movie, you don't really know that Egyptian. You don't know why he was beating that old man other than it was his job. But on the other hand, when Moses flees into the desert, you really do get that sense of heartbreak from Ramses that I just lost my brother. Whereas in Ten Commandments, Ramses actually kicks him out and expels him into the desert. So you really don't see any kind of heartbreak there. And now we enter the part of the movie where Moses is in exile and he comes across his future wife, Sephora, which in the original she's played by Yvonne DiCarlo, who's Lily Munster from the Munsters, which I did not put together until very late in my life, and it's just kind of weird to wrap your head around. And in the remake, she's played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and she's good in both of these versions. She does exactly what Sephora should do in this story, where she's supposed to be the support of Moses. She's supposed to help him understand the ways of God, kind of introduce him to faith while he's in exile in Midia, really help him grow in his identity as a Hebrew. And it's really through her faith is how they end up falling in love and getting married and end up having was probably one of the healthiest marriages in all the Bible. But now let's talk about the burning bush, because this scene in both films is the introduction to God and how God will be represented over the course of this movie, which of course means we're going to be seeing a bit more complicated special effects, or for the sake of animation, just more interesting visuals with that animation. And in comparing these scenes, there really is no contest for which version I like better. I have to give it to Prince of Egypt. I get what the Ten Commandments was going for. It's this very solemn, kind of somber, awe-inspiring moment where Moses just kind of stares at this burning bush and asks it questions. But the burning bush is kind of static, and the effect on it isn't great. It, like, you get it. You get that it's this otherworldly fire, but it just kind of looks like a painting. But on the other hand, Prince of Egypt, they really got creative with how to represent God here, because the fire on the burning bush does not look like normal fire. It's this ethereal blue flame that's kind of swirling and kind of everywhere at once, and Moses even sticks his staff into the bush to see if it'll catch fire, and he touches it and it's not even hot, so he sticks his hand in and his hand just kind of becomes engulfed in flame, but it doesn't burn. So he's all kinds of confused, and then he hears the voice of God, and the voice of God is also Val Kilmer, which all due credit to Ten Commandments, they did this first, where Charlton Heston's voice is the voice of God, at least in the burning bush scene. I'm not really sure if he did it also in the Ten Commandments scene later in the movie. So he definitely did it here, so I can't give Prince of Egypt all the credit, because that idea of having the voice of God also be the voice of Moses, so that it's not necessarily this audible voice, it's more the voice of God in Moses' head. So I do think that's a really interesting approach. But Prince of Egypt takes it a step further, where the voice of God isn't this booming voice, this authoritative, strong, masculine voice that we do get in the Ten Commandments. Instead, we get this very soft and loving and welcoming voice that's kind of enchanting almost, until Moses starts complaining a little bit too much, and then God has to come back with some authority to really prove that he is who he says he is. But then God comes right back into that loving voice, and it embraces Moses and takes him up into the fire, and he sees these wonders and tells him all about what he's going to do when he gets to Pharaoh. And while neither version is bad, I think theologically they're both pretty sound interpretations of how you could do a God voice. I just feel like Prince of Egypt was a lot more thoughtful and intentional about how they depicted the voice of God, and it shows. Now it's time to get back to Egypt and show Pharaoh some plagues. And this is undeniably my favorite part of any Moses adaptation because it is the most visually engaging part, and both movies do a very good job at showing the plagues. My only complaint from both versions is that Aaron barely contributes to any of these. In the original, he's more or less just a background character that kind of follows Moses around from scene to scene, and yeah, he gets some lines, but he doesn't really do much. In the remake, he is voiced by Jeff Goldblum, so you think, okay, maybe he's going to do more, but they really just use him as a foil for Moses, or really the voice of the people when they're not happy with Moses and they're like, you made our work so much harder. Why did you do this? We were better off before you even brought this up to Pharaoh. So yeah, the Aaron that we get in the Bible that actually was the mouthpiece for Moses, because again, Moses was not a great speaker, so Aaron kind of handled a lot of the talking directly to Pharaoh, and he actually performed a couple of the miracles himself. We don't really get that so much, and it is a little disappointing. But what we do get are some really interesting visual representation of these miracles, starting with staffs turning into snakes. And if you know the Bible, you know that Moses put down his staff and it turned into a snake. But Pharaoh wasn't all too impressed with that, so he brought out his magicians and they did the same thing. But I always wondered, how did the Egyptians do the same thing? Because isn't the whole point of the Bible that there's only one God, that these other gods are false and they don't really have magic? And how did they do it? And Ten Commandments really doesn't answer this question, because we do just see them throw down the staff and it just wiggles and turns into snakes, so there's no real answer there. But Prince of Egypt, on the other hand, actually found a way to explain this, because Pharaoh's magicians, Hotep and Hoi, played by Steve Martin and Martin Short, are Vegas-style magicians. They put on a big show, and it's all smoke and mirrors, and the movie has a whole musical number called Playing with the Big Boys, where they put on this magic show, and at the climax of the song, they bring out staffs, they click them together, there's a really bright, blinding light, everybody kind of looks away, and then you see them, and they come out of light, and they're holding snakes. So it does open the door for you to think that, okay, so they just switched it out when nobody was looking. And that's an explanation I can really get behind, because it just emphasizes how much more authentic Moses' power is compared to these false prophets. But we're just getting started, because after that, Pharaoh hardens his heart and we get the 10 plagues, starting with the Nile turning into blood and culminating in the death of the firstborns of Egypt. Now, watching both versions again, there's a lot of kind of give and take from both versions of what I prefer, because by and large, I do like how Prince of Egypt handles this section of the movie. It's this big montage. It's another song called The Plagues, of course, and it's a really creepy song. It's very eerie and intense, and it almost becomes a horror movie a little bit, because you really do get a sense of just how terrifying all these things are. You have blood, you got boils, you got flies, locusts, frogs. It's just everywhere, and everybody's miserable, and darkness on the land, and it's just terrible. And over the course of this montage, you do get a sense of all 10 plagues. I don't think there's any that they left out. Whereas the 3+ hour movie actually leaves out quite a few plagues. They only show the Nile turning into blood, and then they skip ahead to the flaming hail. And all the stuff in between you only hear about through dialogue. You don't actually see it, which is a little disappointing. But, and this is kind of a small detail, I do still prefer how Ten Commandments handles the flaming hail versus Prince of Egypt, because Prince of Egypt depicts it more or less like a really dangerous meteor shower. You have these things falling from the sky, they're burning up on the way down, and then it hits and it just melts, and you assume that's just ice from the sky, which could be comets. You know, that's kind of a naturalistic explanation. But that's not really what the Bible says happened. It's not really flaming hail as it comes down. The Bible says it came down as hail and then burst into flames on the ground, which is what we get in the Ten Commandments. It just looks like a regular old hailstorm, a really bad hailstorm. Everybody goes inside, but then you look at the ground and there are these streaks of flame going every which way, and now you really got to go inside, because now it's even more dangerous. And something tells me that that is a bit more biblically accurate than the meteor shower that we get in Prince of Egypt. But sadly, it takes the loss of Pharaoh's son to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, the thing that makes Pharaoh say, okay, take your people and just go, and take anything you want, just get out. And this scene is handled perfectly in both versions. There's really no complaints. And as much as I've praised Ralph Fiennes' performance over Yul Brynner's performance, both actors do a phenomenal job at the loss and grief of this moment, and you really do feel it. And this brings us to the climax of the film, which is when they all escape, they exodus out of Egypt, and they come to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's hot on their heels because he's had a change of heart. He's like, no, I'm going to get him back. What was I thinking? I'm just going to go and chase him down with my chariots. And there's this pillar of fire that appears, and it blocks their path. And what's really funny is that the pillar of fire visually looks almost identical in both versions, because in the original it was before CGI, and they literally animated a pillar of fire on top of live action because that's just the best technology that they had at the time. And it actually holds up pretty well. The only parts where it looks a little rough is when it's forming and it takes a long time to really kind of get going, and in those moments it looks very cartoony and animated. But when you see that thing picking up speed and swirling around, you believe that there's a pillar of fire there. And it's literally the same thing in the remake, animated and all. But interestingly enough, the giant fire tornado is in the background for the real miracle that people remember, where Moses splits the Red Sea in half and they walk across safely. This is also done very well in both versions, although I think the animated one does have kind of a leg up here because they can really emphasize the water and the slow motion of it and just the awe of walking through it. But that's not to say the original is bad. The original is very epic and big, and it's really crazy to think about how they did it given the technology that they had. And even though it is starting to look a little dated now, you can clearly tell that they just reversed the film of water going into a basin, so it looks like water's coming out and splitting. It's still a much more satisfying climax than whatever they did in Exodus Gods and Kings. But this video is already going long enough without worrying about that dumpster fire of a movie. And after Moses gets his people safely across and the Red Sea collapses and it wipes out all of Pharaoh's men, that's really where it ends for Prince of Egypt. Again, Prince of Egypt is a pretty short movie. It's only an hour and 39 minutes, so they really tried to make this as economic a story as they can. So aside from a really quick shot of Moses holding the 10 Commandments, that's really all we get. But the 10 Commandments, the 3+ hour behemoth that it is, keeps on going because there's so much more story to tell. In fact, we haven't even gotten to the titular 10 Commandments yet. So after Ramses is defeated, the people are free, they go to Mount Sinai and they start having a party. Moses goes up and talks to God, gets the 10 Commandments, and again, God's depicted as this big swirling fire, which is pretty much the exact same visual as the pillar of fire in front of Pharaoh by the Red Sea. So, not terrible, not great either. But what I do like about it is that you actually see God writing out the 10 Commandments. A piece of the fire separates off into something resembling an arm, and you see it scribbling on stone, and it etches in the Hebrew text of each 10 Commandment. What's interesting about how this movie is edited is while Moses is getting the 10 Commandments, it cuts back and forth between that and the situation going on at the bottom of Sinai, which is the golden calf. Basically, the people at the bottom of the mountain are getting restless. They think Moses has abandoned them, so they want to go back to Egypt, but they can't go back to Egypt empty-handed. They're going to erect a golden calf idol so that the Egyptians will welcome them back with open arms. And what's interesting about that is while Moses is receiving the 10 Commandments, the Israelites at the bottom of the mountain are breaking pretty much all 10 Commandments in this one big party. And that kind of irony doesn't go unappreciated. But the fun can't last forever because eventually Moses does come down and he sees what's going on and he's offended. He's like, you guys are breaking all of God's laws. And so he chucks the stone tablets into the golden calf. The ground opens up, the calf falls in, it closes back up, calf is gone. But also, the stone tablets are gone too. And this brings me to a moment that I'm sure had to happen in both the Bible and in this movie that just doesn't really get depicted visually, is when Moses has to go back up the mountain and ask God for a second set because he broke the first set. Can we just please see that somewhere? But then we get a really long dissolve and we see Moses. He's looking much older. He's looking like, the old paintings. He actually looks kind of like Noah. At least how I always imagined Noah to look. Big white beard, big long white hair. And he's clearly on the verge of death, and he actually passes the torch of leadership, or I guess the staff of leadership and the cloak, over to Joshua so that Joshua can bring the people into the promised land. And Moses can go off and die peacefully. And that is the end of both movies. Again, Ten Commandments, very, very long movie, but it is the kind of movie that when you watch it, you do enjoy it. It doesn't feel like a slog. It doesn't feel like homework. You understand all the characters. You like the ones you're supposed to like. You don't like the ones you're not supposed to like. And it is a captivating experience throughout the whole runtime. But I have to say, I just have so much respect for Prince of Egypt, for what it was able to accomplish in a much shorter runtime and in the animated musical format. And that's something I really want to take a little bit of time and talk about, is the songs in this movie, because the songs are crazy good. The songs aren't overdone. There's only like a handful of them, and they all happen in very emotionally important parts, and it just adds to the whole experience. And the tone of each song fits perfectly the emotion or style. In the case of the Plagues, for example, where the style is supposed to be horror and unease, it knocks it out of the park. And I was going to say this back when I was comparing Moses's, but I kind of forgot. The one thing that does really bother me about Prince of Egypt is such a stupid complaint, but it does really bother me, and it's that his beard isn't long enough. Now hear me out, because the Ten Commandments does a phenomenal job with Charlton Heston visually. You understand how much time is passing in each dissolve, you know, when you see his beard and facial hair change. He starts out very clean shaven, then when he discovers he's Hebrew, he starts growing it out a little bit, and then after he gets married, it's a bit longer, and then when he sees God, it starts turning gray and his hair turning white, and that keeps progressing until the very end of the movie, when it is all white all the time and super long. Moses in the Prince of Egypt doesn't really get that same progression. Yes, when he's the Prince of Egypt, he has a little bit of a goatee, and he's pretty much clean shaven. And then when he goes and he suffers in the desert for a little bit, it starts to get a little bit longer. And then by the time he's ready to go see God in the burning bush, he has what really just kind of looks like my kind of beard. You know, it's very kind of close to the face, where, yeah, it's full and he clearly has a beard, but it's kind of short. And from then on, it doesn't change at all. And maybe that's a limitation because of animation, that they have this character model and they want to reuse the character model to save on time and money and animation costs. And I get that, but you could have at least given him a little bit of something different going on after he sees God in the burning bush. Or at the very least, when he comes down at the very end of the movie with the Ten Commandments in that one shot, you couldn't have just made him look a little older? I don't know, it's not the biggest deal, and at the end of the day, I do still really love this movie for what it achieves in such a concise runtime, but I also don't want to shortchange the Ten Commandments. I think both of these movies are phenomenal for what they are. They just take drastically different approaches when it comes to telling this story. I like them both, and I actually don't think the Ten Commandments gets as much love nowadays as it probably should, because it really did solidify a lot of what people think about Moses in popular culture in a way that is pretty biblically accurate. So I gotta give the movie credit for at least that. But now I turn over to you guys. What version of Moses do you like better? Have you seen both? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.